Imagine my surprise years ago when I was called on to assist in the burial of John Belushi, the former star of the popular TV show Saturday Night Live, and movies like Animal House and the Blues Brothers movie. Okay, I should point out that I was asked to assist a Hollywood production crew filming the movie version of Wired, The Short Life and Fast Times of John Belushi. That was a 1984 New York Times bestseller by the author Bob Woodward, but I helped to bury John Belushi nonetheless. In July of 1988, the Mendocino District of the California State Park System received a request from the location manager of a Hollywood movie crew hoping to film certain sequences of Wired at Precarious State Park, a coastal park located 3 miles north of the city of Fort Bragg. Apparently, the movie's director, Larry Pierce, thought that the park area in and around Lake Cleone resembled Martha's Vineyard, where John Belushi is really buried. In addition, the location manager had found a spot within the park which he thought would be ideal for filming the burial scene. To do this, it would be necessary for the movie crew to construct a cemetery like the one in Martha's Vineyard. Precarious State Park is an area that's rich in natural and cultural resources. Although no archaeological sites had been recorded in the immediate area of the film location, there were several known sites situated nearby. Because of the cultural sensitivity of the area, I was asked to review the film company's proposal and to provide recommendations. In order to keep the film industry in California, Governor George Deukmejian had instructed the California State Park System several years earlier to cooperate with the film industry whenever and wherever possible. As a result of this attitude, numerous movies, as well as television shows and commercials, are shot on locations and units of the California State Park System. The Mendocino County coast, given its natural beauty, and the similarity to the New England coast, has been the scene of much filming. Murder, She Wrote, the popular television show that starred Angela Lansbury, was filmed there for several years in and around Mendocino Headland State Park. The movie Overboard was also filmed there. There have been numerous other movies filmed in this area as well. Although most of the filming does not constitute too great a threat to natural and cultural resources, the state park staff did fear that the filming of Wired could possibly impact the cultural resources of Precarious State Park. Not only did the film crew desire to create a cemetery in a potentially sensitive area, but they then decided that they would need to excavate an actual grave pit, the one in which they would bury John Belushi. At this point, it seemed obvious that there needed to be an archaeological review of the project. When the district staff called to tell me about the project, my first thought was just to say no. After all, there didn't seem to be any reason to allow a non-state park project to risk impacting cultural resources. However, once the state park staff pointed out the political realities of the project and reminded me of the governor's mandate, I agreed to visit Precarious so as to review the project. Over the phone, there had been a certain amount of confusion about where the project area was located. If I was going to recommend against a project, it would be necessary to first visit the project site. A few days later, I visited the area that had been chosen for the cemetery. I was relieved to see that it was not a recorded site, although it did appear to be sensitive to the potential discovery of buried archaeological deposits. I inspected the surface carefully and found no archaeological evidence. I also inspected a horse trail that cut through the project area. The horse traffic had worn a path through the sand that extended below the surface to a depth of about 2 feet. I could see no signs of archaeological site presence in the walls of the eroded trail. Therefore, it seemed that there would be no possibility of the filming impacting any cultural resources except through the excavation of the grave pit. The pit was to be dug approximately 6 feet long by 4 feet wide and 5 feet deep. Although the upper 2 feet seemed to be lacking archaeological remains, there was no way of knowing what might be in the lower 3 feet. Being located near Lake Cleone and just a short distance inland from the coast, the project area appeared to be an ideal location for an archaeological site. Following my field inspection at Precarious, I met with the park's management staff to discuss a plan of action. We concluded that it would not be appropriate to completely reject the film crew's proposal. However, we decided to recommend that the location manager select another film site within the park, one that would be less likely to have buried cultural resources. And should that not be possible, we decided that I would need to be on site to supervise the excavation of the mock grave pit. If any archaeological evidence was encountered during the excavation, it would be my decision whether to continue with the excavation or to relocate the grave pit elsewhere. The director had already agreed to fund any archaeological mitigation work we deemed necessary, so we decided on a sum of $5,000 to be set aside by the movie company prior to the excavation of the pit. The funds were to be used by the state park system should the excavation encounter archaeological remains, and it be decided to continue with the dig. On the other hand, should the pit be excavated and prove sterile, the $5,000 would be used to fund needed cultural resource management work within McCarricker State Park. In this way, the $5,000 was looked upon as a special use fee. When the location manager was contacted and told of the options, he stated that regardless of the cost, the director wished to film at the site first requested, and did not desire to relocate somewhere else within the park. The movie company immediately prepared a check in the amount of $5,000 and forwarded it to the California Film Council, where it would be held and later credited to the state park system. Furthermore, the movie company agreed to reimburse the state for my salary and per diem cost in order that I might be on site to monitor the excavation of the grave pit as well as the filming itself. This amounted to 6 days of work, although we did not know it at the time. In 3 weeks, I was scheduled to depart for a 2-month-long trip overseas to attend the Hunter and Gatherer Conference and the first ARA Congress held back-to-back in Darwin, Australia. At the time, I was working to catch up at work, and I must admit that I was not excited about having to drop everything just to be involved in this Hollywood project. Of course, I reminded myself that there was always the possibility of my being discovered by Hollywood. For a short while, I envisioned myself becoming the next Marlon Brando or James Dean. However, after this short-lived silliness, I realized that the inconvenience of the timing far outweighed the prospects of my being discovered. By that time, I had committed myself to the project, and I had to go through with it. As per the arrangements made with the movie company, I would monitor the excavation of the mock grave pit and would be on hand in the event anything of archaeological significance was encountered. The company hired 2 local men to work as laborers on the various filming locations. Filming was to be conducted at 2 different state park locations as well as at 1 or more sites outside the park. It was arranged that the 2 local men would excavate the grave pit under my supervision. I arrived at the Mendocino Coast on Sunday afternoon, the day before the film work was to begin. The following morning at sunup, I met at the park with state park staff and members of the movie company, including the location manager. At this early hour of the morning, I had the first of several revelations. First revelation: Hollywood movie crews work long hours. The group that had assembled for the meeting that morning visited the filming site, where the cemetery was to be recreated, and discussed the final arrangements. At that point, everyone disappeared, leaving me to monitor the empty site. There was a single car parked in the parking lot nearby, and as I walked past it, I noticed a uniformed security guard hired by the movie company to protect the set after hours. A second man seated in the car got out and asked if I was the archaeologist. Yes, but how did you know? Well, you kind of look like an archaeologist, the man drawled, stroking his beard as he talked. I was impressed, but also a bit dismayed that archaeologists had become stereotyped and that I obviously resembled the stereotype. It turned out that the man with whom I was talking was Doug Smith, a local automobile mechanic and one of the 2 locals hired by the movie company to assist me in the excavation of the grave pit. While Doug and I were talking, a large truck arrived at the site, and it was soon apparent that the props were about to be set up. While I stood to the side watching, a small crew of grips and prop managers went about creating a New England cemetery. The truck was full of headstones of various sizes and shapes. The mock stones were made of styrofoam and plywood, and they were complete with the names of the fictional deceased, including the dates and details of their lives, memberships, military service, etc. The location artist had visited the Martha's Vineyard Cemetery, where John Belushi is buried, and so had an idea of how the McCarricker Cemetery should appear. For apparent legal reasons, the movie company did not wish to recreate the Martha's Vineyard Cemetery or any of the headstones of people buried there except for John Belushi's grave. In this case, an exact replica had been manufactured of Belushi's headstone. As for the other headstones, the various names they bore were all fictional, and in fact, many of the stones had been used in previous movies. With the exception of the Belushi headstone, all the others were checked out from one of the major studios' prop room. A few notes might be in order concerning John Belushi's headstone. Just as John Belushi was himself a man who stood out from the ordinary and mundane, so too does his headstone seem unique. As per his own request, Belushi's stone is fashioned from a large piece of natural rock, and it's marked with just his family name, Belushi. The Martha's Vineyard Cemetery, in which he is buried, is part of a relatively conservative community, which was for good reason concerned at the prospects of burying such a colorful celebrity within their midst. As some will remember, John Belushi died in 1982 at the age of 33. He died of a drug and alcohol overdose after a short-lived career that had been as controversial as it was brilliant and as bitter as it was sweet. At the request of the community, John Belushi was buried just inside the cemetery gate, perhaps to keep his grave-visiting fans from traipsing across the many other graves in search of his. Apparently, there was good reason for this concern. Belushi's fans did and still do visit his grave, and many of them leave it disorderly. Gifts of sorts are often left about the gravesite, including such things as beer bottles, seashells, small rocks, and various drug paraphernalia. In order to provide as realistic as possible gravesite, the prop people outfitted Belushi's mock grave with beer bottles, seashells, and the like. Several dozen headstones were erected about the filming location. A white fence was set up about the boundary of the cemetery, and a number of small trees and buckets were placed strategically so as to give the appearance of an actual cemetery. And believe it or not, when the prop people were done with their work, the filming site did look like a cemetery. I can still remember a number of local residents who were accustomed to jogging, walking, or bicycling every day along the adjacent haul road, stopping to discuss the cemetery. You know, I've traveled this road every day for 5 years now, and I can't remember having ever noticed that cemetery before. I heard one of them say that. And another said, after observing the prop artist carefully painting one of the stones so as to resemble bird droppings atop it, he remarked to his wife and friends, "Look, they're doing some kind of historic preservation project on this old cemetery." Some of the passers-by probably never learned different, but most of them did discover that the cemetery was nothing more than Hollywood's make-believe. On learning that a movie was being filmed, most of the park visitors almost instantly affected a glazed look in their eyes and started looking for their favorite movie stars. "Look," I would say, "there goes Robert Redford." Or, "Is that Meryl Streep?" Actually, I'm just kidding. I wouldn't do something like that. Or would I? Actually, there were no big-name stars involved in the filming of Wired. This may have been in part because, to some extent, Hollywood boycotted the production of this movie. If anyone has read Bob Woodward's book, you know that it implicated a number of Hollywood personalities in the same fast-paced and destructive lifestyle that apparently killed John Belushi. In addition, the Belushi family never accepted Woodward's version of John Belushi's life and lifestyle as an accurate picture of him. And for whatever other reasons, some people just didn't think the movie should be made. Director Pierce and producer Ed Feldman appeared to be aware of the controversy and seemed to be intent on producing a movie version of Wired that would treat Belushi's life honestly, and yet in a sensitive and non-controversial manner. Two relatively unknown comedians, Michael Chiklis and Gary Grooms, were hired to play John Belushi and Dan Aykroyd. Wired was the film debut of both actors. Chiklis would go on to star in popular TV series such as The Shield and Gotham. Grooms continued acting too. During the afternoon of the day that the cemetery had been constructed, a brief scene was filmed among the headstones. This scene, which lasted only about 30 seconds, involved a conversation at Belushi's gravesite between Bob Woodward and Judy Belushi, John's widow. The actors said their lines over and over, as the director called for numerous takes. As the sun began to set in the west, and after at least 30 takes, the director was finally pleased with his footage. It was here that I experienced two more revelations, concluding that movie directors are perfectionists. And it gets boring standing around on a movie set listening to actors repeating the same lines over and over again. As you can see, by now I'd become jaded, and I'd all but given up on the idea that I might be discovered. On the second day of the project, we actually began the excavation of John Belushi's grave. At sunup, a number of us were at the cemetery to make final plans for the excavation. The director was called to the site to make the final choice for where to bury Belushi. Once his decision was made, we began to dig the grave. In addition to Doug Smith, I was joined by Bugs Anderson, a local musician who had also been hired by the movie company as a laborer. Doug and Bugs were cool and a whole lot of fun to work with. A unit was laid out measuring 6 feet by 4 feet. We began to dig, and we found that the going was quite easy. The soil was loose sand with no rocks, roots, or archaeological remains in it to slow us down. I had screens and assorted archaeological equipment on the site just in case it was needed. The tools sitting nearby added a certain mystery to the project, and all morning I kept using the word science. After an hour or two, we were more than halfway to the bottom of the intended 5-foot deep pit. Nothing of archaeological significance had been encountered, and at this point it looked as if nothing would be found. Although relieved that the project would not mean a long and tedious lab project, I did find myself wishing that we'd find something, if only a little something, so as to partly justify my original reservations. But the best we could do was a single unmodified rock found near the base of the pit. We examined the rock closely for quite some time, with me using the term science several times again. When we were done, the rock got tossed into the back dirt. After all, it was just a rock. Doug and Bugs asked what my most impressive archaeological find had ever been. And for just a moment, I thought about lying and making up some story about my early years in Egypt, or perhaps Mesopotamia. But being too honest to lie, I told the truth, which didn't seem to impress my co-workers very much. For one reason or another, the last few feet of the pit took the rest of the day to dig, which pleased 2/3 of the crew since they were being paid by the hour. At the end of the day, when we had completed the pit and found absolutely nothing, the Hollywood people returned to the site and they seemed pleased at our finding. The next day would see the filming of the burial scene. To our surprise, the director instructed his staff to hire Doug and Bugs to play Blues Brothers band members in the burial scene. They were excited as they departed the site at the end of the workday. While we had been excavating the grave pit, the rest of the movie crew had been on the beach in the 10 Mile Dunes area of the park, filming another scene. In that scene, John and Judy Belushi walked down a New England beach talking. A large wave tosses a dead 8-foot-long shark ashore in front of them. Therefore, it was necessary to have a shark on site for the filming. The call went out, and a shark was found for rent from an institute in Southern California. Overnight, the 8-foot-long lemon shark caught off the coast of Thailand in 1961 was flown in a box to the San Francisco airport and then trucked to McCarricker. The shark arrived just after sunup, as movie crew and park visitors alike milled around the cemetery. When the lid of the coffin-like box was removed so that the director could see the shark, a park visitor was overheard to say, "Look at the shark. They must be making another Jaws movie." When the director looked into the box, he shouted, "It's yellow. It'll never do." At this point, the crew's main artist walked up and took one look at the shark and then said, "Don't sweat it. A little paint here and a little bit there and it'll look just fine." I looked over at the man who had rented the shark, and his face was turning white at the thoughts of someone painting this dead shark. He expressed his concerns. "Don't worry," the artist told him. "It'll wash right off with a little water." As we looked at the shark, the sun was growing warmer, and the formaldehyde that had been sloshing around in the bottom of the box had begun to leak out. It seemed like a good time to return to the cemetery. After the shark was taken away to undergo its makeover, the time came to film the big burial scene. About 300 locals had been hired for the day as extras. 100 of the people were to play the part of members of the press covering the service, while the rest, all dressed in dark clothing, played the part of mourners. All the movie crew assembled on site too. A legendary stuntman was supposed to participate but had not yet arrived. After a while, I noticed that many of the crew were scanning the sky. Apparently, this particular stuntman was renowned for making spectacular entrances. Within a few minutes, I noticed a small plane circling in air high above the set. As we all watched from below, a man leaped from the plane and plummeted rapidly toward the ground. We all waited for the parachute to deploy, but for the longest time it seemed as if it wouldn't. There was a rising apprehension among the onlookers that we were about to witness a tragedy. At the very last moment, the man pulled the cord and his parachute sprang into action, quickly slowing his descent. The stunt thrilled the crowd of onlookers, and it generated a lot of applause. But the real excitement came when the stuntman hit the ground. He aimed to shoot for a patch of green, thinking that it was grass. Instead, it was a 10-foot-high mound of blackberry bushes with briars galore. The brush consumed the fallen man. After a brief pause, we heard him call out in a rather meek voice, "Does anybody know what I'm in?" Apparently, he feared that he had landed in poison oak. Some of the film crew rushed to his aid and, with some doing, managed to extricate him. The filming went well that day, but it took the entire day to complete it. It was unusually hot for the coast, and the hundreds of people who were dressed in black overcoats, wraps, and hats, as if attending a burial in the New England winter, suffered terribly from the heat. It was a day of hurry up and wait, but the catered food was good. That was another revelation I had at the beginning of the week. Movie crews eat well. The burial service was filmed from a lot of different angles, and there were a lot of takes for each of the angles, which made for a long day. The local undertaker came to the site with a coffin, which the movie company had rented from him for the day. The undertaker was really impressed with the grave pit my crew and I had dug, and for a brief moment my dig mates thought that maybe they had stumbled upon another line of work. Then the undertaker heard how much it had cost to dig the pit, $5,000, and decided to pass on employing our services. And speaking of how much it cost to dig the pit, I overheard one woman who had been hired as an extra complaining to her friend about how the state archaeologist had tried to hold up the project. Why, they had an archaeologist here who's making $5,000 a day. That's what she said. In a couple of days, filming had ended. The headstones had been trucked back to Hollywood, and the cemetery no longer looked like a cemetery. I was standing there alone on the final day, when two couples rode up on their bicycles. "Well, dear, where's the cemetery?" a man asked his wife. Apparently, she had told him about the cemetery, and he had pointed out that there wasn't one there. It resulted in an argument and subsequent visit to prove whether it was real or not. I thought of going over and explaining the whole thing to the two couples, but decided on further reflection that some things are better not explained. Besides, it gave the man and woman a lot to talk about. I imagined their conversation. "You need glasses." "No, I don't." "You're just getting senile and imagining things." "No, I'm not," etc., etc. When I returned to my office in Santa Rosa, I gave considerable thought to the project in an attempt to identify its positive and negative attributes. My involvement, after all, had been to safeguard the park's resources as mandated by CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. This was possibly the first time that I'm aware of that a resource manager monitored an entire film project from start to finish. As a result, I was able to identify certain environmental concerns that would have escaped detection otherwise. For example, what impact on fragile natural resources results from 400 people just standing around? Also, a couple of small fires started by people smoking in heavy dry grass. However, most of the impacts that I observed were small things that could be safeguarded against the next time. That's probably the main achievement of the project. As for its archaeological value, nothing was destroyed or compromised, but then nothing was gained either. Except we did receive $5,000 to fund cultural resource management work at the park. Perhaps that was achievement enough. All in all, this project was a lot of fun, and I'm glad I was involved with it. The movie crew with whom I worked was very professional and genuinely sensitive to the park's environmental concerns. But come to think of it, I wasn't discovered. Postscript. Wired was released by Taurus Entertainment in 1989. It suffered at the box office and closed within a few days of opening. It was later released on video by Lionsgate Home Entertainment, and then re-released by Avid Home Entertainment. It's now out of print. I have a copy of Wired on video, which I've yet to view in its entirety. For me, the experience of having worked on this movie is more memorable than the movie itself.